So we are continuing our series here, and we're in the second part of the cosmological argument. So just in review, last week we talked a little bit about what's called the Leibnitzian cosmological argument, and we talked about how that is what we call atemporal, meaning it does not depend on time at all. And in fact, even if the universe were eternal in time or infinite in past time, the Leibnizian cosmological argument, which starts by asking the question, why is there something rather than nothing, would hold even if it were a past infinite universe. These are theistic arguments, as we talked about, are arguments from for the existence of God, and again, these are cosmological arguments. And we talked a bit about what is cosmology, and of course it's the branch of philosophy dealing with the origin and general structure of the universe. It's the why are we here, what is here, it's the study of the universe. And one of the things we said last week is that anytime you see in the Bible the heavens and the earth, that means the universe, because there is no Hebrew word for the heavens or for the universe, so they would use the idiom the heavens and the earth. As we all know, the Bible starts with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then in Colossians 1:16, it says, for by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or power. All things were created through him and for him. Now, again, in review, why is there something rather than nothing? That's what Leibniz asked. That's the question he asked, and that's the question that we tried to look at last week. And his is what's known as the contingency argument, meaning that you can't have an infinite regress of contingent things. What is a contingent thing? Well, this Bible is a contingent thing. This bottle of water is a contingent thing, meaning something else brought it into being, that it did not have to be there. And we said that in the end of that, there has to be a uncaused cause, a necessary being, right? And that's what we talked about last week. And we talked about the fact that it goes on the principle of sufficient reason, which says that for every fact, there must be a sufficient reason why that fact exists. Why is it the case? And perhaps the most important thing in talking to an atheist who is a scientist or believes in what's called scientism or naturalism is if we deny the principle of sufficient reason, then you cannot do science. Science is based on the principle of sufficient reason, that if I do X plus Y, I will get the result Z, right? This is all in review. But this week, we're going to talk about the Kalam Cosmological Argument. And I love this argument, in part because it is so simple, you could train a kindergarten student to take this argument and explain it. But it is also such an eloquent argument that philosophers at the highest levels still can write paper after paper after paper and talk about this for hours on end. Okay? Now, the argument is actually called the Kalam argument because of the next guy I'm going to show you a picture of, in referring back to this guy, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was a 12th and 13th century, 12th century I think, Muslim apologist. And the reason that he came up with the origins of this argument was because he felt that there were too many Muslims when they went into Egypt and Alexandria who had kind of brought in too many of the ancient Greek philosophical ways of thinking, which was that the universe was past eternal. And Al-Ghazali said that can't be. And he came up with the basis of the Kalam cosmological argument. Well, it kind of fell out of favor for a little while, in part in Christian apologetics because it came from a Muslim. But William Lane Craig, when he was at the University of Birmingham, wrote his doctoral thesis on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. And the reason he called it Kalam is because Kalam is kind of, it's like the word, basically, like the scriptures. It's a word that kind of encompasses that in Arabic. So he used that term to name this argument. He's at the Talbot School of Theology, and what we'll be talking about tonight is kind of his formulation of it. Now, I will tell you, however, we aren't going to spend 8 sessions, which is what he does in his defender's class on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Before we even get started, I'm going to preface for all of the atheist YouTube aficionados that will watch this video, I will fully admit, as will Dr. Craig, as will anyone who defends the Kalam Cosmological Argument, that this argument does not get you to the Christian God. It's never meant to. If you remember, we are doing a classical apologetic approach, which is that first you get people to believe that God exists, and then step 2, then you show that the Christian God is the correct God to worship. Okay? So what we are trying to get at with all cosmological arguments, the Kalam in particular, is that uncaused first cause. Now I'm going to show you that at the end of this session, that in reality, you truly get really close to a description of what the scriptures describe God as. But it is not in and of itself meant to get you to the Christian God, just that God exists. Okay? So you have to understand that up front. It is a brilliantly simple argument. Premise number 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise number 2, the universe began to exist. Premise number 3, therefore the universe has a cause. Like I said, you could teach a kindergarten student this argument, but it is a bit more complex than that. So let's start with premise number 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems awfully intuitive to me. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. This bottle of water began to exist. Something had to have caused that. This microphone, this computer, you name it. It is something that is always verified and has never been nullified. Right? If you stop and think about it, can you think of any object in this universe that began to exist that doesn't have a cause for its existence? I cannot. But believe it or not, and by the way, as we talked about earlier, science is based on the assumption that the natural world behaves in a consistent and predictable manner. And part of that is the law of causation. The principle of sufficient reason. For every fact, there is a cause for that fact. There's a reason behind that fact. And we talked about arguments from analogy, meaning if you're alike in one way, then we can draw inferences to something else. So if I were walking along and I saw a cell phone sitting on the sidewalk, automatically I'm going to think somebody made this. Never in a million years would you walk down the sidewalk, see an iPhone sitting there and think, I think that just popped into existence out of nothing. Right? It doesn't happen. In fact, if the universe or anything popped into existence out of nothing, then there would be nothing to make us think that that shouldn't be happening all the time. Why isn't a horse just popping into existence right here out of nothing? We've never, ever witnessed that. Same thing would be true. A lot of people will use a building or buildings in a city. Buildings always indicate that there was an architect and a builder. Always. It is always verified, never nullified. Right? So, believe it or not, though, there are people that object to this first premise. And even Dr. Craig will say in his videos, he said it shocked him when he first put out this argument that people would actually object to this. But believe it or not, they are. And these two objections come from one of the papers that is in that folder that I've sent out to you guys, where he talks about the 10 most ridiculous objections to his Kalam Cosmological Argument. And the first one is this: the first premise is based on the fallacy of composition. It fallaciously infers that because everything in the universe has a cause, therefore the whole universe has a cause. So raise your hand if you know what the fallacy of composition is. Okay, so it's actually quite simple. It basically says that it's the fallacy to believe that the properties of the parts of a whole are going to be the same properties as the whole. One example of this would be an elephant is very heavy. But if you look at each cell of the elephant, it is very light. So a fallacy there would be to say, well, every cell of the elephant is very light, therefore an elephant is very light. Right? That's the fallacy of composition. So, as an example, you have a picture of a feather here. If you had 1,000,000 feathers, feather of course is very light, but if you had 1,000,000 feathers, the fallacy of composition would be to say, well, because one feather is light, then 1,000,000 feathers must be light. And I don't mean each one individually, I mean a group of 1,000,000 feathers. A group of 1,000,000 feathers is probably going to be pretty heavy, certainly heavier than each individual feather. The other would be a brick. You may say, well, it's fairly easy to throw a brick. But you'd be fallacious to think that you could throw a brick wall because you could throw a brick. Right? So what they're saying is it's the fallacy of composition to say that because everything in the universe has a cause, the universe has a cause. But something can't come from nothing. The Latin phrase is ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes. If something can come into being from nothing, why do we not ever experience that? None of us sitting in this room, and I dare say no one in the history of the world has ever experienced something popping into existence out of nothing. Common experience, scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise one. Premise one is constantly verified, never falsified. Some people will even say that the universe caused itself to pop into existence. Now, let's think about that. For you to cause yourself to come into existence, you had to pre-exist yourself. It's beyond comprehension. If you pre-existed your own self, then why would you need to bring yourself into existence? It doesn't make sense. So that objection itself is ridiculous. Okay? Objection number two, if the universe began to exist, then it must have come from nothing. That is quite plausible, since there are no constraints on nothing, and so nothing can do anything, including producing the universe. Now, Dr. Craig likes to use an example of saying, well, nothing stopped the German advance toward Russia. And the person he's talking to says, well, thank God, nothing stopped it. And he says, no, you don't understand. Nothing stopped the advance. And the person said, I'm very grateful for nothing. He goes, no. They weren't stopped because nothing was there to stop them. And the person goes, oh. You see, nothing is not anything. Scientists are so, and again, I'll remind you, I'm a chemist by training, and I'm a physician. But some scientists are so bent on saying that everything has to be from material that they are willing to say that things like vacuums are nothing. That's not true. Nothing is no thing. No time, no space, no matter, no energy. Nothing. We can't honestly really conceive of that. If you stop and think about what existed before the Big Bang, what comes to mind? I think of darkness. I don't know why. Because there's nothing that actually says to me that it would be dark. But there was no time, there was no space, there was no matter, there was no energy. Nothing means no thing. So if nothing is there, then something can't pop out of it without an external cause. So first of all, before we move on to the next one, is there anybody that has questions about premise number one? Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Okay. By the way, if we do have any questions, I do ask that please grab the mic so that the folks on the video that are watching later can hear the question. Because even when I ramp up the sound, it's sometimes very hard for them to hear the questions. Okay, so let's move on to premise two. The universe began to exist. Now, I'm going to give you guys several different ways of looking at the fact that the universe cannot have been past eternal or infinite. So let's talk about infinity for just a moment. All of us in school, maybe save a young man right here, learned about infinity in school, right? And there are certain things you can't do with the symbol infinity in math, right? Well, that is a theoretical concept, okay? In math, although there are actual mathematical sets and mathematical set theory that talk about true infinite numbers, how do most of us think about infinity? Like an infinite number of writing pens. Is that you can always add one more to it, right? Okay. That's the concept of infinity. The concept of infinity is that it is beyond all numbers. Okay? Now, people will oftentimes say there's an infinite number of stars in the universe, or there's an infinite number of grains of sand on Earth. Is that true? No. Theoretically, you could count the grains of sand on the Earth. Don't try it, but theoretically you could. In fact, there's even an estimate of how many subatomic particles there are in the universe. There is an actual number there. But what we're talking about is an actual infinity. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples and reasons how an actual infinity, especially when we're talking about an infinite time, cannot exist. The first we're going to talk about is David Hilbert. He's a famous mathematician. And he talked about a hotel. First, he gives an example of a regular hotel. Let's say it has 250 rooms in it. And they're all full. Next guest walks in, says, I'd like to get a room. He says, sir, ma'am, I'm very sorry. We don't have any rooms. You're going to have to find another hotel. That's how a normal hotel works. But with Hilbert's hotel, imagine a hotel that has an infinite number of rooms. So in that infinite number of rooms, an infinite number of guests with flesh and blood, real people are occupying every single room in the infinite hotel. Now, if I asked you, if James walked in and said, talking to the proprietor, I need a room for tonight, what would the proprietor say to you? Is there a vacancy? You would say yes. Okay, you would be wrong. Because in an infinite hotel, all the proprietor needs to do is move person in room 1 to room 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and then there's a vacancy. In fact, what he could do, even more, is take everybody in room 1 and double, or in their room, and double the number, right? 1 would become 2, 2 would move to room 4, the one that started in 4 would go to 8, the one that started in 8 would go to 16, 16 to 32, and then I'm bad at math after that. But it would open up an infinite number of rooms. So, in Hilbert's hotel, if it were full, you could come in and say, I want a room. And the proprietor would say, no problem. And he moves all of them like that because any doubled number is an even number. So all of the odd numbered rooms would be left available. By doing that, he could even have an infinite number of people come into his hotel. Right? because all he'd ever have to do, if he doubles the numbers, it would open up an infinite number of rooms. Now the problem starts coming when people start to leave and check out. So now we're completely full. An infinite number of rooms are housed by an infinite number of people. What if everyone in the odd-numbered rooms checked out? How many people just checked out of the hotel? An infinite number of people. Leaving, how many people? An infinite number of people. Okay? Now, and you may say, well, then that would leave also an infinite number of empty rooms. You'd be wrong. Because I just told you they checked out of all the odd numbered rooms. So you start dividing by 2, and all of them in those even numbered would move down, and all of the rooms would be filled with an infinite number of people. What's even crazier? What if everybody above the number of room 4, so 4 and up, checked out of the hotel? How many people checked out of the hotel? An infinite number. How many people were left in the hotel? 3. Now, if I said to you 10 minus 10 is equal to 0, but 10 minus 10 is also equal to 3, what would you tell me? I'm crazy, right? Because that defeats laws of mathematics. But that starts to show you the ridiculousness of Hilbert's Hotel. I like to look at the infinite past. To me, it's a little easier if I look at an infinite library. Every other book is red, every other book is black. Okay? Everybody following so far? Infinite number of books. If I remove all the red books, how many books did I remove? An infinite number, because it's an infinite library. How many books are left? An infinite number. Okay? So you took an infinite minus an infinite and got an infinite. Now, because you still have an infinite number of black books, right? Now, what if, there we go. So in other words, an infinity minus an infinity equals an infinity. Okay? Everybody follow? But what if I numbered those books starting at book number 1? And I removed every book beyond book number 3. How many did I remove? An infinite number. How many are left? 3. So, in one case, infinity minus infinity equals infinity. In the second case, infinity minus infinity equals 3. Those are self-contradictory. And what did we talk about as being the first law of philosophy? The law of non-contradiction. Those are contradictory. They are impossible. It's like a married bachelor. Okay? And to that, one pigeon says to the other, what are other words for nonsensical? And the professor says preposterous, absurd, ridiculous, ludicrous, foolish, silly, senseless, stupid, idiotic, and meaningless. Okay? An actual infinite cannot exist. Let's look at it in a different way. If you thought of time like this, if today is day 0, yesterday was day 0 minus 1. T minus 1, right? Day before that, T minus 2, minus 3, minus 1. Theoretically, if you kept winding the clock back, if the universe were infinite, it would be like walking on a yardstick back into infinity. Everybody following so far? Okay. The problem is that can't happen. There's a couple reasons that can't happen. First of all, it would be like this young lady who continues to try to get the Starbucks cup walking on the moving sidewalk. She'll never get to the beginning of time. Because if it were infinitely far in the past, no matter how much she stepped into the past, she'd never actually get to the beginning of it in order to start moving forward. Another way of looking at it is if I had an infinite number of dominoes falling from the past, would I ever get to today's red domino to fall? The answer is no. No one could ever be going and walking along going, -3 days, -2 days, -1 day, finally today. We are evidence sitting here talking now that an infinite past cannot exist. Because if time never started, you'd never get to today. Does that make sense? You can't do it. And notice, I haven't touched the Bible, and I haven't used science at all. Okay? Now, oh man, it didn't come out quite right. Okay, so you guys all know R2-D2. Now we're going to talk about the scientific evidence. You don't know who R2-D2 is? Oh, it's from Star Wars. You got homework, young man. You got to watch episode 4, A New Beginning. Okay. The original. But no, R2-D2, okay? But we're not going to be talking about R2-D2. We're going to talk about R2-B2, okay? R2-B2. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's the way I remember the 4 scientific things that tell us there is no past infinite universe, that the universe, in fact, had a beginning. The first is relativity, specifically the theory of general relativity. The second is the red shift. The third is the cosmic background radiation, that's the B. And the 2 at the end is the second law of thermodynamics. Everybody knows this wild-haired guy probably, right? This is Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein came up with his theory of general relativity. Now, I should point out that at that time, and Einstein included, almost all scientists believed that the universe was past infinite. Okay? They believed that the universe had been around in some form or fashion forever. But Einstein came up with his theory of general relativity. But he realized in doing his calculations that if his theory was true, that it would lead to or have the consequence that the universe would be expanding. Well, if you work in reverse of an expanding universe, the universe in the past would have been shrinking. Think of it like a ball or a balloon, okay? If you were to glue buttons on a balloon and blow it up, if you ran that in reverse, it would shrink and ultimately come down to nothing, right? Einstein was so bothered by this that he fudged his numbers. And he added in a fudge factor that kept it at a steady state. Okay? Well, building on his work, Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre in 1922 and 27 developed a model from his theory of general relativity and showed that by his calculations, in reality, the universe should be expanding, which meant that it had to have come from what they called the cosmic egg exploding at the moment of creation. This is what ultimately ended up becoming known as the Big Bang Theory, which I think I pointed out last week was actually somebody making fun of it. Okay? Why? Because they thought they were a proponent of the steady state model, meaning the universe had always been around and was steady. It wasn't expanding or contracting. And so they didn't like this theory because they understood the implications were, if you have a beginning of the universe, wait a minute, maybe Genesis 1:1 is right. So they called it the Big Bang, and that term stuck around. Well, At that time, that was Fred Hoyle. Sir Fred Hoyle said, one idea was that the universe started its life a finite time ago in a single huge explosion, and that the present expansion is a relic of the violence of this explosion. This Big Bang idea seemed to me to be unsatisfactory even before a detailed examination showed that it leads to serious difficulties. The problem is that all physics since then has shown that the model of the universe expanding is correct, which means that if you run it back in time, it came from nothing. Okay? Well, they didn't have very much, if any, actual hard evidence of that until Edwin Hubble. All of us have probably heard of the Hubble telescope. Edwin Hubble was a very famous astronomer and physicist who was looking into the night sky, and he was doing measurements of the light coming from stars. And lo and behold, he noticed what was known as the red shift. If you recall back to school where we talk about the prism, right? Light is Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Okay? Light that is moving away from the observer will have a shift toward the red end of the visible spectrum. If it's moving toward you, it will have a blue shift to the light. If it is perfectly stationary, it will look white. Okay? What Hubble noticed was that no matter where he trained his telescope into the night sky, the lights showed a red shift. So that's the second R in R2B2, red shift. No matter where he looked, all of the stars were moving away from us and each other. Okay? Which was the first evidence that the universe, in fact, was expanding as indicated by the theory of general relativity. Now, it doesn't stop there. That's just the law. We won't belabor that. Following that, in the 1960s, Penzias and Wilson at Bell Laboratories were looking at the universe, and what they discovered was the cosmic background radiation. You see, if the world exploded into existence out of nothing, whether that were from a naturalistic standpoint or a theistic standpoint, there would be a huge burst of energy as all energy and matter and time and space came into existence. Well, it was predicted that there should be some background radiation from that explosion into existence. And when they looked and did their measurements from Bell Laboratories, at first they literally thought that it was pigeons messing on the roof of their satellite. Went up there and cleaned it off, and lo and behold, it wasn't. It was the fact that they were picking up microwave radiation as the background from the initial explosion of the universe into existence. Showing, again, now not just that the universe is expanding, but that it came in from an initial pop. Of course, all of us in this room would say that was from when God said, "Let there be light," right? But not only that, it has been confirmed in many, many experiments, including by NASA in the future, or in future generations, that not only is there cosmic background radiation from the initial explosion of everything into existence, but all of these little dots are galaxies and stars coming into existence. It's the background radiation from each of those. So as each of the galaxies and stars form, each of those, because the energy coalesced, gives off background radiation. And they noticed all of those and picked up all of those as well. The last one, remember R2B2, is the second law of thermodynamics. This one gives us a couple of points of data to talk about in terms of a theistic argument. What the second law of thermodynamics states is that energy transformations lead to an increase in entropy. Entropy is just disorder, right? If I have a bottle of unfrozen water and an ice cube, this is in relative order. The ice cube is in relative order. But if I put the ice cube into the bottle of water, what happens? The ice cube melts, right? Technically what happens is the energy in the warm water gives the energy to the ice, and the ice melts. And it becomes actually more chaotic, okay? Well, basically, the concept is everything goes from ordered to disordered unless something is pumping energy in or taking it out, right? Now you may say, well, how is that? What's that got to do with anything? Well, two things. Stars are hot. They have a limited amount of fuel in them. Thus, stars ultimately run out of gas, as it were, and they suffer heat death. Now let's stop and think about that. If the past were infinitely long, if the universe were eternal in past, what would we be experiencing right now? Heat death would have already happened to the universe. So the first question you'd have to ask is, why is there still any star burning if the past were infinite? It couldn't be. Not unless someone were ordering it and putting energy in. Okay? The second thing it does is it tells us, again, that the universe, unless God or some other supernatural thing supersedes, will ultimately burn out. That's how we know that if it had a past eternal universe, it would have already burnt out. Now, in addition to that, let's talk about, there's one other piece of information there, and that is this, because many people in the scientific community have come up with many models, which we won't go over tonight, trying to get away and get out of the concept that the universe had a beginning. Why? Because they are committed to the idea that and they understand that a beginning of the universe implies a creator. They don't want that. So they've come up with like the multiverse model and fluctuating models where the universe expands, contracts, all the way back into infinity. The problem is in 2003, Arvin Bohr, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, three of the world's most prominent physicists, came up with their theorem. And they conclude that there are no models at this time that provide a satisfactory model for a universe without a beginning. None of these scenarios can actually be past eternal. All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. In fact, Vilenkin says this in his book, and he goes so far as to say, it is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. So, remember in deductive arguments, if premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true and they follow each other, the conclusion is by definition true. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. Do we think that that is more likely than its counter-argument? Yes. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. All evidence points toward that, both from philosophy and the impossibility of a past infinite universe and from all scientific data. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, again, does the Kalam Cosmological Argument get you to the God of Christianity? It's not meant to. It's meant to get you to the existence of God. But let's look at what the cause of the universe, what properties would that cause need? Well, again, the beginning of the universe marks the beginning of all time, space, matter, and energy. So in order for there to be a cause of the universe, it has to be outside of time. It has to be timeless. In order for the cause of the universe to be outside of the universe, it has to be spaceless. And it has to be immaterial. Why? Because all time, space, and matter came into existence at the beginning of the universe. Also, clearly, in order for all energy in the universe to have been brought into existence out of nothing, the creator of the universe had to be exceedingly powerful. And the last one, which is probably the one that most atheists will give you a hard time about, is it had to be a personal creator. Let's talk about each of those a little bit more. Again, timeless. All time, space, and material came into existence. So it had to exist outside of time. Now, I would implore you, if you're using this argument, don't use the term eternal or infinite in discussing God. Because they may say, well, if you say the universe cannot be eternal or cannot be infinite, then you can't say the cause of it can. And that's a fair argument. What we're really saying is that God is outside of time. He stepped into time when he made time, but beyond that, he was timeless. Okay? The second thing is, obviously, he can't occupy space. Why? Because space did not exist before God created space. Space, time, and matter came into existence together. Before that, there was no space. That's why we talked at the very beginning about not being able to even envision what nothing means, because it doesn't have space. Okay? It had to be immaterial. The cause had to be immaterial. Why? Because if the cause were material, then the cause itself would have been infinite in the past, and we've already talked about the impossibility of that. And obviously very powerful, immensely powerful, in order to bring about all space, energy, and matter. And the last one that people really have a hard time with sometimes is this one, personal. It had to be an unembodied mind. There are only two things that could exist like we're talking about here, and that is an abstract object or an immaterial mind. Right? Numbers don't have space, they don't have time, they don't have material. Okay? So they exist outside of that. They are timeless, spaceless, immaterial, all those things that we just talked about. And then the mind, not a brain, the mind, right? Now, can an abstract object do anything? No. Can't do it. A number can't do anything. A number certainly can't choose to create. A mind, an unembodied mind, however, can make the decision to create. And what was our first question Leibniz asked? Why is there something rather than nothing? The unembodied mind of God would be required to make the decision to create instead of not create. In other words, we could have just as easily not had a universe. God could have chosen not to. But only an unembodied personal being or mind could do that. Now, if you look at the attributes of God, eternal, immutable, self-sufficient, wise, omniscient, sovereign, omnipotent, patient, grace, jealous, holy, good, righteous, faithful, truth. Those lists start to sound an awful lot alike, I would say. Okay? Let's look at some objections to the Kalam Cosmological Argument. The first one, actually, that I would say is that most people who argue with number one is that they misunderstand number one. What is argument number, or what is premise number one? Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Because the question that most atheists will ask is, well, if everything has a cause, why doesn't God, what's the cause of God? Who caused God? In fact, that's the central premise of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. Who caused God? Is that what we say in the Kalam Cosmological Argument? No, we don't say everything has a cause. We say everything that begins to exist has a cause. What do we believe as Christians about God? That God does not begin to exist. He exists outside of time and space. He has always been there. He is the uncaused first cause. Oftentimes they'll say it's a God of the gaps argument. But creation is not a God of the gaps argument. It is an inference to the best explanation. It is an argument from analogy, just like we talked about. When you see a building, you think there is a builder. When you see a cell phone, you think there's a cell phone company. When you see a universe, you think someone made the universe. It's an argument from analogy. Then you have guys like Stephen Hawking saying things like, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. That would prompt me to say that even brilliant people say stupid things. Right? Because the first question is, or the first thing to say is, again, nothing is no thing. What is gravity? Well, first of all, I will tell you that there is a lot of questions in the philosophy of science as to what gravity actually is. But gravity is not nothing. It's a law of the attraction of two objects to each other. Right now, me and Earth. Right? But the question would be, upon what would gravity act before matter existed? It's a nonsensical statement. Because there is a law like gravity. The second part of that is, the law of gravity is a description of the natural world. If the natural world doesn't exist, just what exactly are you describing? Again, nothing is no thing. The other one comes from Lawrence Krauss, who is a physicist, a professor of physics at Arizona State University. There are a lot of things I could say against Arizona State University, not the least of which is they only have 4% of their students who actually are science majors, but nevertheless, Lawrence Krauss has made most of his career out of writing books about atheism, and he wrote this book, A Universe from Nothing, where there is something, why there is something rather than nothing. And I'm going to read this to you because I know it's kind of hard there. But basically, he states that quantum physics is why the universe exists. And when asked if Krauss's book answers the question posed by its subtitle, one man says, certainly not. He is presenting untested speculative theories of how things came into existence out of a pre-existing complex of entities, including variational principles, quantum field theory, specific symmetry groups, a bubbling vacuum, all the components of the standard model of particle physics, and so on. He does not explain in what way these entities could have pre-existed the coming into being of the universe, why they should have existed at all, or why they should have had the form they did. And he gives no experimental or observational processes whereby he could test these vivid speculations of the supposed universe-generating mechanisms. How indeed can you test what existed before the universe existed? You can't. Thus, what he is presenting is not tested science, it's a philosophical speculation, which he apparently believes is so compelling he does not have to give any specification of evidence that would confirm it is true. This is from another scientist. And that prompts me to say, as I said earlier, with math or with numbers, science doesn't say anything scientists do. And sometimes the things that come out of their mouths are absolutely ridiculously preposterous. Because what he proposes in his book is that nothing is not nothing. It's fluctuating fields of gravity and energy. Does that sound like nothing to you? Because it doesn't to me or to anyone else who has ever studied the philosophical thought of nothing. Nothing means no thing. No energy, no matter, no substance, no time, no space. That's not nothing. And that's the entire premise of Krauss's book, that a quantum vacuum brought the universe into existence. Much of my data came from Reasonable Faith. It is it's the book from William Lane Craig. It is in your folder that we've sent out. This one is a more kind of lay look at it. Reasonable Faith is actually meant to be a textbook of the philosophy of religion. It's by Frank Turek and Norman Geisler. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Also, there's another textbook, Reason and Religious Belief, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and Christian Apologetics. And at that, I'll answer your questions. And amazingly enough, we got through all of that in 56 minutes. Okay. Step number 1, everything that comes into existence or begins to exist has a cause. Step number 2, the universe began to exist. Step number 3, therefore the universe has a cause. And the cause had to be outside of time, space, matter, and be personal, which sounds an awful lot to me like God. Any questions? Okay. So next week, we're going to start moving into the teleological argument, which is the argument from design, which looks at the immense complexity of everything from the universe to our solar system, to our galaxy, the Milky Way, to our solar system itself, to our planet, down to even life and DNA. So we'll actually take several weeks to look at that because there is an incredible amount of detail that science has helped us with in the world of theology because it points to a designer. And so we're going to take a lot of time with that. It's one of the things I kind of tend to gravitate toward because there's a lot of life biology and chemistry and things like that in it. So I'll try not to geek out too much on you guys in the next couple weeks, okay? Too late. We hope that you enjoyed the content of our video today. If you did, make sure to give us a thumbs up and share this content. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so that you are alerted to any new content that we post on our channel. Please remember that all of our video content is completely free of charge and can be reposted, shared, and embedded. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/armorofgodapologetics with an S. Thank you for watching and have a blessed day.